I'll talk you through the photos in the book. The first one is, of course, Christopher Steele, who is a former British intelligence officer who's really at the heart of this story. There's an interesting photo of him, which has never been seen previously, from early 1991, when he was a junior spy, you might say, based at the British Embassy in Moscow. Of course, then it was the Soviet Union. The country was opening up for the first time, and this image was taken when he was traveling in the provinces. He was the sort of embassy's internal traveler, and he met with a group of journalists in Tatarstan. Young guy, interesting photo, interesting job, and really I think it's important because Moscow was sort of formative for him, and obviously fed into all the work that he did later, both for British intelligence and as a kind of corporate consultant. And this is his product. This is the famous Steele dossier, which he worked on essentially from the spring of 2016. Initially, there was a Republican opponent of Trump who commissioned his work, and then subsequently the Democrats took over the contract. And the thing about this dossier, published by BuzzFeed, is that it sets out the key allegation against Donald Trump, that he has been colluding with Russia, assisted by Moscow for at least 5 years, and moreover, that the Russians and Vladimir Putin are in some way blackmailing him. And to understand the story, you need to read the dossier, and one of the things I do in the book is, of course, to kind of evaluate it. And another thing I do is to contextualize what happened in a tradition of Russian and indeed Soviet espionage. And here we've got photos of Donald Trump looking a bit thinner and a bit younger. It's summer 1987, he's with Ivana, his first wife, and they're visiting the Soviet Union for the first time. This photo shows them in St. Petersburg, or back then it was Leningrad. And I think what's kind of interesting about it is that the trip was arranged by Entourage, the Soviet travel agency, and that is essentially the KGB. In other words, to be clear, Trump was invited to Moscow, to Soviet Moscow, by the Soviet ambassador, and all the details were taken care of by the KGB, the spy agency. And the other thing you have to know is that this guy on the right, who's called General Vladimir Khrushchev, was the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service of the KGB. And we know from leaks that he sent out a series of memos to KGB heads of station in Washington, in London, saying, you must do more to recruit Americans. Basically, that not enough American targets were being kind of processed. Now, this is not to say that Trump was recruited back in 1987, but I think what's clear is there was a determined effort to cultivate him. And then you see him in Moscow again. The photo at the bottom is showing Trump with his characteristic thumbs up, with Aras Agalarov, who's a kind of tycoon, a kind of Russian Donald Trump, Agalarov's son Emin, and this is the Miss Universe beauty pageant of 2013. And the big question about this is, did Trump misbehave with prostitutes, as alleged by Steele in the famous dossier, or did he go to bed early with a cup of hot chocolate and sleep very soundly? There is the famous hotel, that's the RitzCarlton, where he stayed in November 2013. I know it well from my time in Moscow. It's at the bottom of Tverskaya. You can walk pretty quickly down to Red Square. You can go and see Embalm Lenin. So the huge question is what happened in the presidential suite where Trump stayed. But I think what I would say is that it's clear to me, as someone who was myself surveilled when I was there, that clearly he was filmed. As indeed anybody would who stayed in the presidential suite. The question is what happened when he was there. There's someone else from this story, a rather unprepossessing British character called Rob Goldstone, who's a music promoter who promoted Aras Agalarov, who's a sort of pop star. And again, the reason he's significant is that it was Goldstone who subsequently, in the summer of 2016, emailed Donald Trump Jr. and set up, that's Donald Trump Jr., set up this kind of incredible secret meeting between Donald Trump Jr. and this lady who's called Natalia Veselnitskaya. She's a Russian lawyer, a Russian advocate, who was essentially, so Donald Trump Jr. thought, delivering compromising material, hacked emails from Hillary Clinton. Now, that didn't quite happen. She delivered something else. It was a dossier arguing against American sanctions on Russia, but nonetheless, she was the emissary sent by the Kremlin, you might say, to interact with the Trump team, Trump campaign team, and A, they took the meeting, and B, they concealed the meeting afterwards for almost a year. Now, the other question I explore in this book is links, alleged links, between Donald Trump and Russian organized crime, and the person on the right is a famous Soviet and Russian mobster called Vyacheslav Ivankov. You can see his kind of criminal tattoo there. He moved to America in early 1991, and the FBI were hunting him for 3 years, and eventually they found him, living in Trump Tower, and he was eventually jailed. This is Donald Trump with another famous Russian, this is Sergei Kislyak, who's the Russian ambassador to the United States. This is their meeting in the Oval Office earlier this year, and Kislyak is interesting because one of the things I discovered was that his father was a very famous spy working for the KGB, whose job in the 1970s was trying to influence European politics in France, in Greece, and so on. And this aspect of Kislyak's family story has been kept very quiet by Moscow. I wonder why. Then this is the famous handshake between Trump and Putin. They finally met at the G20 summit in Hamburg this summer of 2017. And it was curious. Everyone was looking at the body language. Trump is holding out his arm like a kind of petitioner. And I think what was remarkable about this encounter, apart from the fact they got on, was that later that evening, Trump dumped his official interpreter and had a kind of one-to-one meeting with Vladimir Putin over dinner, and no one knows what they talked about. There was no record, there were no notes. And of course, for those who are skeptical about this relationship, this suggested that certain things were being discussed in private and agreed. Now, I think one of the interesting things about this story is the number of connections that Trump's entourage, Trump's team in government, especially to begin with, have with Russia. Now, there's a photo there of Michael Flynn, who was Trump's short-lived national security advisor. He lasted 23 days, and there he is with none other than Mr. Putin again at a dinner for RT, the Kremlin propaganda channel, in 2015. Flynn took money from Russian interests. He didn't declare it. And then we have another person with a massive Russian connection. That's Paul Manafort, newly indicted by the special prosecutor Robert Mueller. And Manafort I write about my meeting with him in 2008 in Ukraine's capital, Kiev. He's been accused of money laundering, and really he is the nexus between Russian oligarchic and state interests and Trump, I think, more than anyone else. There are some weird people in this story as well. One of them is Carter Page. My chapter about him is titled, I Think He's an Idiot, which is not my opinion. This is taken from what a Russian spy wrote about him in an email, who met him in 2013. And he was a Trump foreign policy advisor who made this very odd trip to Moscow in early summer 2016. Carter Page says nothing to see here. The dossier alleges that he was meeting Russian officials and was another back channel. And then we have the upright hero of this story. That's James Comey, a director of the FBI, fired dramatically in May 2017, and there he is giving testimony after Trump dumped him out in I think one of the kind of great set pieces of Washington's history. And then at the bottom there you have Robert Mueller, who's the special prosecutor appointed in the wake of Comey's defenestration, who with a non-leaking team has been tasked to investigate collusion, and he seems to be moving at speed. We've had 3 indictments so far, and I suspect more will follow. And then we've got a member of the imperial family. That's Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, who also, I think, is under investigation, and was also very much targeted by Russian spies during the election, and held a secret meeting with one of them, Sergei Gorkov, in Trump Tower. And here are some of the Russian characters involved. There's Dmitry Rybolovlev, who is an oligarch, owns a football team, has a yacht, has a private jet, and also just happened to buy Trump's seaside Florida mansion in 2008. Trump had bought it for $41 million. 4 years later, at the peak of the financial crisis, Rybolovlev bought it for $95 million. Why would he do that? We don't know, but it's an interesting jigsaw piece. And then the guy here to the left of Putin is Igor Sechin, who's the head of Rosneft, the main oil producer in Russia who's effectively the second most powerful person in Russia after Putin. And down at the bottom, to round up our set, we have an undercover Russian spy, the hapless Yevgeny Buryakov, who was working at a Russian bank, but was actually employed by the SVR, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, and he got caught, he got jailed, and now he's gone home. It's a fascinating set of characters. It's a fascinating book, and I think the pictures tell their own story. They say that Russia has been interested in Donald Trump for a long time, certainly since the 1980s, and we see this meshing between the two camps, culminating in Trump becoming president, much to everybody's surprise, probably to Putin's surprise, and what I think is the biggest political story since Watergate, but probably bigger than Watergate.